Good morning and welcome to our coverage of the Israel-Hamas war. I'm Olumide Macaulay. Coming up today, Israel says it has opened corridor for civilians in Gaza to evacuate south. United States officials working to secure a humanitarian pause in Gaza. Former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson meets British Israeli army soldiers in Jerusalem, expresses support. Thank you for joining us for today's edition. Gaza was struck by fresh explosions on Sunday night. According to officials in Palestine, the enclave was under unprecedented bombardment by Israel. The blasts and flares were seen in Gaza from southern Israel. The Israel Defense Forces IDF, on the other hand, says its ground forces took control of a Hamas outpost in Gaza last night, adding that in the operation, a number of terrorists were eliminated. The IDF also says that during the last day, its fighter jets attacked about 450 targets, including military compounds, observation posts, anti-tank posts, and more. The Israeli army released video which shows the opening of a humanitarian corridor to allow civilians to northern Gaza to evacuate south. The videos were accompanied by a video message delivered in Arabic from Israeli Army Colonel Moshe Tetro, asking Gazan residents to leave the northern part of the Palestinian enclave, which he described as a war zone. He was quoted as saying, "I am currently standing at the Salah al-Din Road south of the Zaytun neighborhood. Today we opened the Salah al-Din Road as a humanitarian corridor for civilians of the northern Gaza Strip. I ask again that all civilians of the northern Gaza Strip move south of the Wadi Gaza. The northern Gaza Strip and Gaza City are a war zone, a very dangerous area. The criminal Hamas terrorist organization are using you as human shields. Move south of the Wadi Gaza. We are facilitating humanitarian aid to the area of the South Wadi Gaza." Health officials in Hamas-controlled Gaza say more than 9,770 Palestinians have been killed in the war, which began when Hamas launched a surprise attack in southern Israel on October 7, killing 1,400 people and taking more than 240 hostage. U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken says the United States officials are working to secure a humanitarian pause in Gaza that will advance several priorities, including getting more aid into Palestine and getting hostages held by Hamas released. Speaking to reporters after an unannounced stop in Baghdad, Mr. Blinken says there were now 100 trucks of aid moving into the besieged coastal enclave each day, but he added that it's grossly insufficient. After a visit to the occupied West Bank early on Sunday, Mr. Blinken landed in Baghdad on his first visit to the country as the top U.S. diplomat holding talks with the Iraqi Prime Minister Mohammed al-Sudani.
Well, first, as we said, following my conversations with the Prime Minister and with the Israeli government, this is a process. Israel's raised important questions about how humanitarian pauses would work. We've got to answer those questions. We're working on exactly that. In fact, we agreed that our teams would get together, and they're doing just that, including today, to work through the specifics, the practicalities of these pauses. Second, it's important that the pause advance a number of things. One of them is hostages. We are intensely focused, the United States, Israel, every other country that has one of its citizens being held hostage by Hamas, to bring them home. Now, it's important that as we're engaged in pursuing humanitarian pause, this can be something that advances the prospect of getting the hostages back. It can also advance other things that we're committed to doing, as is the government of Israel and other partners in the region, especially getting more humanitarian assistance to people who need it in Gaza. I'll remind you, when we had conversations 3 weeks ago about starting humanitarian assistance, it was a process to actually get that moving. but we had a commitment to do that. It took some days to get the process in place. Since then, we've had trucks moving. We have about 100 trucks a day going in. That's good, but it's grossly insufficient. So now we're working on raising that significantly so that more aid in a sustained way gets into Palestinians who need it. There again, humanitarian pause can also help advance that and create an environment in which we can do as much as possible for people who so desperately need the assistance.
Earlier, the head of the World Food Program, WFP, Cindy McCain, made a desperate plea for the safe delivery of humanitarian aid to Gaza. Ms. McCain released a written statement in which she says the aid currently entering Gaza is nowhere near enough to meet the needs of the people there.
People are living in a horrific nightmare. Food and water are running out. A steady flow of aid is needed to meet the desperate needs now. Humanitarians must be able to deliver it safely, and civilians must be able to reach it safely. Without this, lives will be lost and conflict will spread.
Former British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has met with British soldiers enlisted with the Israeli army in Jerusalem. During the meeting, Mr. Boris Johnson expressed his support for the troops, saying he disagrees with those trying to make a moral equivalent between what the soldiers are doing and what Hamas is doing. The British Prime Minister was accompanied by former Australian Prime Minister Scott Morrison, where they both visited the kibbutz Kfar Aza, which was devastated by Hamas in the October 7 attacks.
Some of us have been living here for years now.
There's been no single attack like this on the Jewish people since the Second World War, and that's a matter of record. And you know what? I think that that may be because across the world, the memory and the lesson of that appalling crime, and 6 million died, the memory may be starting to fade. And it may be that what we're really seeing now in some of these marches and these demos and the unthinking way people are talking about this issue, well, we're starting to see perhaps, I really hope this isn't the case, but you're seeing more and more evidence of anti-Semitism. And in the end, that is something that simply cannot be tolerated, neither in my country nor anywhere else.
Look around. This is the end of anti-Semitism. This is where it ends. Those expressions of hate and against Jewish people. This is what it becomes. What we are seeing around us here today. That's why it can't be tolerated in its most smallest form, because it starts as a mustard seed and it grows into this horror.
Let's now talk to Mr. Stephen Hayes, President Emeritus, Corporate Council on Africa, former President, American Center on International Leadership, and currently a partner of Gainful Solutions. Good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning. How are you today?
I'm very well. We thank you for being with us. Let's begin with Iran, who have been accused of being leading a proxy war against Israel, and who have been accused by the IDF of having foreknowledge of this attack. And even if they didn't, they had a lot to do with helping the Hamas to get ready for this attack. Now, we understand that Iran is going to chair the Human Rights Council sometime this week in the United Nations. Isn't that like when they were alive, Ted Bundy or Charles Manson being the DAs in their state?
Well, I think it's an absurdity. It's outrageous. It's the UN at this stage. It's just simply, there's no other words than absurdity, a comedy that Iran would be heading a Human Rights Council. Even forgetting this war, what's happening in Iran as well to its own citizenry, it's a mockery of the term human rights.
The moral equivalence that former Prime Minister Boris Johnson was speaking of, where the argument has been that, okay, look, what happened was as a result of Gaza being a keg of gunpowder that was going to go off because of the, as it was put it, the oppression of the Gazans by the Israelis. So this was going to happen at any time. What do you make of such an argument?
Well, it's not a moral equivalency. There is a lot of truth to the fact that Gaza has been essentially almost a very large prison camp for 2 decades. Most Gazans can't get out. Most of them have never been outside of Gaza, frankly, because the Egyptians as well as the Israelis kept them contained. Only a limited number can get out. So that to me is factual. Now, does that justify what happened? No, it doesn't. What Hamas did is horrendous, and it just simply cannot say that was justified in any way. Was it inevitable? No, of course not. It's a conscious decision by people to do that. An act of desperation, perhaps, but certainly Iran had to know about this. How did they get so many arms? They had to be smuggled into Gaza. They had to be using the tunnel network, and it had to come from somewhere. Almost certainly it came from Iran. So Iran is not an innocent party. They've certainly allied themselves with Hamas as well as Hezbollah. So it does go back to Iran to a considerable extent. What's also interesting to me is the fact that the Putin meeting with the Iranian leadership recently. This war certainly helps Putin and Russia and Ukraine right now. So there's a number of actors, it seems to me almost like a 3D chess game, being played by different levels by different actors. And the United States, for one, is scrambling to keep up.
You just mentioned Russia. Isn't that like the pot calling the kettle black, where senior Russian official says that accuses Israel and saying that they are occupiers?
Well, of course, and where there is a comparison, I think, is between Hamas attacking Israel and Russia attacking Ukraine, both killing civilians with as a means of terror and war, and that's deliberate.
Does that make Russia does that make Russia appear in a different light now? For those who are trying to understand the Russia-Ukraine war and the history behind the territories in Ukraine that where there are ethnic Russians and the desire for them to be a part of Russia and the whole demise of the USSR, but now that Russia seems to be siding with Hamas, what does that do for Israeli-Moscow relations?
Well, obviously that weakens them at best between the Israelis and the Russians. The Israelis won't forget it, I'm sure. They have obviously very, very long memories. I think the Russian-Iranian alliance on this, in particular the Iranian arms supply going to Russia as well, has really moved Putin into a more open alliance with Iran and also with Hamas. As far as Ukraine goes, the progress is slow, if any, and I think that there's going to be a lot of pressure on Ukraine as a result of the war, the Israeli and Hamas war, and that certainly is working to Putin's favor.
We talked about justification for this war, and it's expressed that there is no justification for the October 7 attack and the attack on innocent children and babies and mothers. How then can you explain the support that Hamas finds in the United States, where you are, for instance, where there's been demonstrations in many cities, many university campuses, and some of them of a violent nature where Jews are being targeted? We're told that Jews are 2% of your population in your country, but they are victims of over 50% of hate crimes in America.
I'm not sure of the percentages, but the 2% is certainly right, and certainly there's a lot of hate crimes aimed at the Jewish population, as well as, frankly, there's hate crimes aimed at the Muslim population in the United States as well. I mean, the interesting thing is that the Semites, the term anti-Semitic, both the Arabs and the Jews of Israel were Semites. And we now limit that to primarily to say any anti-Semitic action is against Jewish, but it's also against Muslim as well, against Arabs especially. So no, you can't justify it. Certainly you can say that people have a right to demonstrate for what they feel is injustice. Gaza is not a just situation. There's a lot of factors that go into it. And so, I think that people who demonstrate for a more merciful action towards the Palestinians have every right to do so. And it doesn't mean that it's anti-Semitic. What does show as anti-Semitic are the personal attacks on both the Jewish population and the Muslim population in the U.S.
Thank you for reminding us that Semites includes Arabs as well, but now anti-Semitic is taken to mean only anti-Jews. But has it helped any in the United States where Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib dodged the bullet and escaped a censure in the House of the House members wanting to vote against her? And she dodged that bullet for being, according to them, saying things that were pro-Hamas and stirring up the pot of controversy against Israel.
Well, she has a right to say that, and it's interesting that 32 Republicans voted in favor of, or in support of her. That combined with the Democrats was enough to avoid the censure. So I think she has a right to say it. Do I agree with it? No. But I think she has a right to say it, and I think that's why the 32 Republicans also voted. I doubt if any of them agreed with her, or very few. But it is still a constitutional right of free speech in this country. So I think she has every right to say that. And again, it doesn't mean that I agree with it. I agree with the principle of her being able to speak what she feels is right. Whether it's right or wrong is another issue.
But what one of your officials, Marjorie Taylor Greene, was trying to say was that the way what she was saying and repeating the slogans such as "from the river to the sea" is taken to mean by the Israelis that you're calling for the annihilation of the Jews. You want them to disappear from the river to the sea. So if a congresswoman is saying that it's taken to incite violence, wasn't that a proper fear?
I don't know. I'd have to get inside her mind to know exactly what she meant. As I said, I don't agree with what she said. And I think it was an unfortunate choice of words. But of course, if anybody has made a series of unfortunate choice of words, it's been Marjorie Taylor Greene, who has just been outrageous in Congress as well. So I think right now we really need cooler heads in Congress. I'm not sure that we have that. I think the country has a number of problems related to both the Ukraine war, the Israeli war, and our own cold civil war inside the United States.
Back to Israel and what's happening on the ground there, as the situation in Gaza, very dire, though much better than when there was no aid at all. We heard from the WFP official who was saying that it's not enough, it's nowhere near enough, and the proportion of casualties, civilian casualties in relation to the Israeli casualties is abysmal. So where do you think countries such as the United States should stand, even though they do say that they're calling for a humanitarian pause? But that seems to have been refused by Benjamin Netanyahu. So is Anthony Blinken's, so is his visit an exercise in futility? Because this is the second time he's gone to Tel Aviv and is the second time he's been turned down.
Well, I agree that the number of trucks going in is insufficient. Even if you had said that one truck feeds 10,000 people, 100 trucks would be feeding 1 million, but unfortunately there's 2 million people in Gaza. So it's vastly insufficient. I doubt if one truck load would feed 10,000 people as well. So there is real human crises there. No doubt about it. They've got to get in. In terms of the ceasefire, you obviously need a ceasefire. Netanyahu is holding in the same way that I think some of the I ask myself, I guess, would other countries in the Middle East do the same thing as Netanyahu? And I'm afraid they would. But nevertheless, he feels strongly that the hostages' only chance is, in fact, to continue the bombing. I think also, even if the hostages weren't there, Netanyahu has a historic animosity, personal as well as national animosity to the Palestinians. So I think that a ceasefire is badly needed. There is no, to me, it's inexcusable that there's got to be over 10,000 people now who have been killed, mostly women and children, apparently, by almost anybody's account. There is no excuse for that. We can say, yes, Israel was invaded. Yes, it has a right to defend itself. And yes, Hamas will use all kinds of trickery. And Netanyahu is probably right to assume that they would use the ceasefire to strengthen themselves rather than have constructive talks. There doesn't look like there's a compromise. So the bottom line is that this is just a very, very tough situation. No one's solved it yet. Blinken certainly hasn't solved it in meeting with the Arab leaders. The Arab leaders haven't come up with a solution yet, other than to say, let's have a ceasefire. And there are reasons not to accept the ceasefire, but I think the human casualties on civilians, women and children, as well as men, frankly, make a ceasefire the overriding need.
Mr. Hayes, even though the Arab League, even though the Arab nations and the Middle East nations such as Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, Iran say they support Hamas, and in spite of that, there's not much they've done in way of that support. How far do you think they're willing to go to support Hamas? We heard from is it Hezbollah now, or Iran, right, where they said that, look, we're not going to tolerate. They went on and on, but they stopped short of saying anything as far as joining Hamas with boots on the ground or getting involved totally in the altercation, in the war with Israel, aside from threatening the United States. So do you think some of these nations are paying lip service to Hamas, and they may not be as supportive as perhaps Hamas first calculated?
I think I'm glad you brought that up. I've thought the exact same thing, that lip service is one thing and rhetoric, but not that I'm begging them to get involved in the crises. But the fact is that they've talked but very little support. The history of the Palestinians since 1948 have been that they've gotten very little support. They've gotten token support from the Arab world, but there's been very little support for their cause because, in fact, most countries don't want to go to war on that basis. The 67 war was won, 73, but since then nobody wants to really take on the cause of the Palestinians. Jordan doesn't want Palestinians coming in because it would tip the numbers in their own country, and the Palestinians could easily outnumber the number of Jordanian citizens. So that creates its own problem. Egypt has repressed the Palestinians very frankly. They've kept them from movement. They've closed the gates. And so there hasn't been much more than lip service and using the Palestinians as a means to get at Israel, particularly Iran and Hezbollah and Hamas. So do we want to create this situation where the Arab nations do step in? It's hard to see that they will, because it will bring on a war for sure. If Israel and Iran go, then the United States is in it. And then we have and Europe then will also be a question mark. Britain will certainly be in it. And then we've got a world careening very much out of control.
Yeah, because who really wants a war with Israel? Look at the infrastructure destruction of Gaza. Saudi Arabia just hosted WrestleMania, and there's peace there. So who wants Riyadh, that is? So who wants Lebanon can't afford to have their infrastructure destroyed if they attack Israel and Israel starts bombing them. So what do you also make of reports that possibly Wagner mercenary group will be sending anti-aircraft missiles to Hezbollah?
You know, one of the things about this whole crisis is that we all believe what we want to believe to some extent. But I believe that, in fact, yes, the Wagner Group / Russia is supplying arms to Hamas. I believe that they will. Russia can do the deniability again, once again, say, well, that's Wagner Group, it's a private business. But Wagner Groups, everyone knows Wagner operates under the rule of the Russians. So do I think the Russians are helping? Yes, I do. Do I have the proof of that? Absolutely not. But perhaps others do.
How does that happen? Because there is a significant number of Jews in Moscow, and the Russian Federation has a lot of Jews. How, Mr. Hayes, can you help us understand how President Vladimir Putin is able to support Hamas or support Iran while there's so many Jews in Russia?
Well, the difference is, and it could be as many in Russia as there are in the U.S. I don't think quite as many, but there was a very large percentage relative to the U.S. as well in Russia. The difference is that the Jewish population, like the rest of the United States, still has the right to vote. Putin has really repressed the people. It's anybody who objects to Putin either disappears or goes into prison now. So it's very difficult for anyone to form a demonstration. In fact, it's virtually impossible now in Russia. So you're not going to see a lot of dissidents. It goes back to, again, the 1970s too, and the dissidents there at that time. There was more freedom in the 1970s for Jewish dissidents than there are now, and they were persecuted in the 70s. So it's not surprising that you don't hear much from the Jewish population in Russia. They really can't.
Because it's ironic, finally, that this was the same President Vladimir Putin that was accusing Ukraine of Nazification, and part of the reasons for the invasion was denazification of Ukraine. The same President Vladimir Putin that was up in arms against the Canadian speaker who had to quit his job because he didn't have enough knowledge of the Holocaust and was honoring a Nazi war criminal.
Yep, that's right. He did resign. We had talked about that earlier, and he did resign, and it is inexcusable that a Speaker of the House would have such little knowledge, but then that also makes me reflect on what's happening in the United States as well, so we'll have to wait and see. But yes, it's the ironies never cease to move forward.
Well, thank you, Mr. Hayes, for your time this morning and your contributions. Mr. Stephen Hayes is President Emeritus Corporate Counsel on Africa and of the Gainful Solutions, a partner. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. An honor as usual. Take care.
Likewise. Still ahead. Israeli mother pleads for return of her kidnapped 19-year-old daughter, Nama. That's the girl's name. We'll have that story and more after the break. Please stay with us. Welcome back. Hezbollah lawmaker Hassan Fadlallah says an Israeli strike on a car in South Lebanon killed 3 children and their grandmother, calling the attack a dangerous development for which Israel will pay a price. The lawmaker says the mother of the 3 children, all aged between 8 and 14, were wounded in the attack which struck the car as it drove between the villages of Ainata and Tarun near the Israeli border. Israel's army spokesperson, Rear Admiral Daniel Hagari, gave no details of the reported attack in Lebanon, but says the military operatives based on intelligence information and examines every event in Lebanon thoroughly. A French military airplane carrying 18 tons of humanitarian aid for Gaza arrived over the weekend in Egypt. Supplies include medicine, food, and generators meant to alleviate the plight of Palestinian civilians in the besieged Gaza Strip. A military plane and crew were chosen to bring the vital supplies to Al Arish, an Egyptian port close to the Palestinian enclave due to the airfield's proximity with the combat area. France also says it was sending the naval vessel to the eastern Mediterranean on what it described as a mission to support Gaza hospitals. Foreign nationals say they were stuck at Gaza's Rafah border crossing over the weekend after evacuations were suspended. According to Egyptian officials, the evacuations were suspended after an Israeli strike on Friday on an ambulance in Gaza being used to transport injured people. Egyptian, U.S., and Qatari officials say efforts were underway to resume evacuations of injured Gazans and foreign nationals through the Rafah crossing to Egypt. People with German and Egyptian nationality called on their respective governments to help them leave with their families, saying things get more dangerous in Gaza with every day that passes. An Israeli mother, Ayelet Levi Shekar, is pleading for the return of a kidnapped 19-year-old daughter. For Shekar, her daughter Naama was the pride and joy of her life. She says her daughter was determined and a very young girl with a promising future. It was on October the 7th that Shekar happened to see something she will wholesomely regret, watching a video of her daughter, hands tied behind her back, in tattered pajamas, covered in bruises and cuts, being thrown into the back of a car as Hamas terrorists repeatedly yelled in Arabic. Naama, who just began her duties in the Israeli Defense Forces, had been stationed in the kibbutz near Oz, one of the first targets of the gunmen during the October 7 rampage. Her mother says in her words, "Oh, I just want this all to be over. I just want Naama back home." Take a listen.
Since then, you can't go around not seeing that footage somewhere, because they kept showing it in loops and on the different TV programs and on social media and wherever you look. And so I just kind of, I just shut it every time. But you just see my little girl there, and she's bleeding in different places, and she's barefoot. She's in her pajamas, and in gray sweatpants, and the pants look dirty. I try to keep my thoughts on her coming back and how she comes back to me. And I talk to her all the time, and I see her in my mind, but then my mind keeps wandering to, where does she lie down? Where does she put her head? Is she eating? Is she sleeping? Does she have water? Does she have fresh air? Does she have air at all? Because we know that maybe she's underground, probably.
Now let's talk to a professor of political science and comparative political economy and international relations, Professor Olufemi Mimiko, who is speaking to us from here, from Ocean State, I believe. Good morning, sir. Welcome to the program.
Morning. Thanks for having me.
Firstly, the courage of that woman that we just heard, her testimony of how she's handling the captivity of her daughter at the hands of Hamas. She is a very courageous woman. I can't fathom what she's going through. I must mention also that this must be the way the families of the Chibok and Dapchi girls that were kidnapped in the northeastern part of Nigeria. And for instance, Leah Sharibu, who is still kidnapped. She's still a hostage after all these years. This must be how they're feeling at the time. Could you speak to how, what your thoughts were when you first heard of the October 7 attacks in Israel?
Let me start by noting, just as you mentioned, that the young lady has actually demonstrated a lot of courage. some other people in her shoes who have broken down completely, who have become complete emotional wreck. But the fact that she still talks about the event and quite hopeful, that's a demonstration of some courage. When October 7 happened, I must confess that I wasn't too surprised by the fact that it happened. The element of surprise was the fact that the Israeli intelligence did not get a hint of that event. It was almost unbelievable, given the very, very high reputation of Mossad and the other arms of the Israeli intelligence. And so the question was, how was Hamas able to plan such an extensive attack, massive in its scope, and it's done so quietly without anybody having a hint of it? That was the surprise element. The fact that a violent occurrence, a violent situation was going to happen was almost predictable. It was almost predictable that at some point there would be a spike, given some of the events that had happened prior October 7. And I'm talking of specific ones. For instance, you recall that the Israeli Prime Minister went to the United Nations General Assembly and demonstrated a map that practically erased all their mention of Palestine. You could predict that that was going to incense the Arab world and the Arab community. The increasing expansion of settlements in occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem, and elsewhere was also an indicator that some form of event was going to happen to follow all of that. And of course, thirdly, you also recall that the current government headed by Netanyahu happens to be the most right-wing government the state of Israel has had since 1948. Not even the Ben-Gurion government of 48 was as right-wing oriented as this current one, with some very, very well-known extremists put into very strong positions in government. It was almost predictable that there was going to be a blowout somehow, but one was not sure exactly where it was going to come from. And as I said, the element of surprise was that such an event of that magnitude that would lead to the invasion of the state of Israel with all the security apparatuses, and lead to the killing of innocent people in the range of 1,400. It was almost unimaginable. So that's my take on that.
The Israelis say that investigations at the end of this war will reveal where the lapses in intelligence led to the October 7 attack. But Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu seemed to have robbed his people the wrong way when he published on Twitter, or I should say X, a statement that seemed to absolve himself of responsibility, saying that he wasn't warned by the security agencies. He took that statement off X. Immediately after he did that, obviously he got backlash from his people. How do you think he will survive his prime ministership after this entire affair?
I'm not under any illusion that Netanyahu is going to survive this. I can't see that happening. You recall that prior October 7, the Israeli society had gotten completely divided into two, if you will. Those on the side of the so-called reforms that Netanyahu insisted he was going to carry through, and of course, what you could call the preponderance of the Israeli population that was resisting that, thinking that it was a deliberate attack on the institution of democracy. And so that division was there. The October 7 attack and what the Prime Minister has been doing since then, they are not going to take away that division in any way. As a matter of fact, as soon as this current war comes to an end, you could predict that certainly there will be a major shake-up in the Israeli government system. I want to believe that that very uncomfortable position that Netanyahu occupies is actually a factor in the, if you will, prolongation of this crisis. There's something in international relations we call the diversionary theory that leaders tend to latch onto when they face situations of crisis are closed. They look for an external issue, crisis or conflict, and just hold on to that as a basis for mobilizing people behind their own private agenda. That seems to me that that Prime Minister Netanyahu is considerably into that, and that will be a factor in the prolongation of the war. Except we're able to make that distinction between what constitutes the interests of the state of Israel and what constitutes the political desires and aspirations of a Netanyahu that is in charge, we may not be able to begin to identify how the war is going to end. And it may not end quite soon as long as Netanyahu continues with this baggage that he has. And so it's understandable that he's talking about, technically absolving himself. I think it's too early for that, for the Prime Minister of the State of Israel to be absolving himself after the invasion of the country and the murder of 1,400. I think it's too precipitated. At the end of the war, I'm certain that there will be a major shake-up in the Israeli, not just the political, but also the intelligence community.
To Gaza itself and the West Bank and Gaza, the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, the details of the complexities in their relationship, now that Hamas has proven itself or has demonstrated terrorist activity once again with this October 7 attack, where does that leave the Palestinian Authority? At the end of the day, we've heard that Anthony Blinken was speaking to the Israelis or saying something to the effect that a government that will be a neutral government put in place where it will be overseen by possibly authorities outside Gaza who will help to keep the peace and ensure that those sorts of extreme attacks don't happen again. Do the Gazans themselves or the Palestinians themselves have a responsibility to distance themselves from the sorts of activities that Hamas is perpetrating so as not to be painted with the same brush?
You see, this is a danger in the type of carnage that we're seeing in the war on Gaza. It's a danger because you're getting a new generation of Palestinians that will be committed to what we call the policy of revanchism, the policy of revenge. The nature of the destruction that we're witnessing, especially to women and children, will certainly engender a new wave of anti-Israel sentiment. You can't run away from that. As a matter of fact, I recall that Hamas itself did not come into relevance until after the PLO under late Yasser Arafat in 1988 recognized Resolution 242. It was a major risk, a political risk that Yasser Arafat took. Formal recognition of the state, the right of the state of Israel to exist within secured borders, and also, consequent upon that, the recognition of the Palestinian Liberation Organization as the sole representative of the Palestinian people. That was a major challenge. There was no follow-up. It was the frustration with that process, that demonstration of commitment or the desire to exchange the peaceful option for the extremist one that the PLO had propagated before. It was because there was no follow-up, no development, therefore, that Hamas came and suddenly became very, very relevant. And so the point I'm making is that the nature of the destruction and the damage that is going on in Gaza is not going to make the Gazans to move away from extremist positions. Yes, they may want to move away from Hamas as a political party, but I'm sure that more people in Gaza today will have been radicalized by the events of now. And I mean, these are realities. We cannot pretend, and it's not something we can just I admonish people not to be violent when we see what they have gone through. And that's why it is important for this war to be brought to an end as quickly as possible, so that the possibilities of peace will not become completely an impossible thing, so to say.
In the case of Yasser Arafat, as extremist as he was, he did make those concessions, which you did mention. But at the end of the day, he backpedaled on agreeing to let Israel become who they were supposed to be in that particular area. Same as Yitzhak Rabin. So he had the fallout of Hamas emerging on his side, and the fallout, I think, of the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin on the Israeli side. So, but that's the peculiar state of that particular area. Why did they have to be always a resort to violence to solve problems?
These are problems that have been lingering for 70 years or thereabout. And the world has not found a solution to it. As the EU foreign policy spokesperson, Joseph Borrell, pointed out, the world has failed completely, disastrously. I mean, in the Middle East, due to our inability to find a solution to this. And so if a problem has been lingering for 70 years or more, and the people have been under what you have to accept is a form of oppression, it's difficult to assume that people will just simply forget their rights and peace will then be something everybody is going to embrace, especially against the backdrop. And I made the point, I chose my words carefully, that PLO and Yasser Arafat took political risks because it was very unpopular at the time they took that move to recognize Resolution 242. Which
but they didn't have a choice, Professor.
Right of Israel.
What choice will they have? What choice did they have, though? They didn't have a choice. If they wanted peace, should they have not recognized Israel?
They were into something before 1988. They could have sustained it. Hamas took over from where the PLO stopped. The PLO recognized Israel in 1988. Hamas was set up in 1987. And that extremism, that axis of resistance, is what Hamas represents. So,
are you saying that the PLO should not have recognized, sorry, Professor, are you saying that PLO should not have recognized Israel?
No, I'm saying that there should have been a follow-up on that process.
Right.
The PLO recognized the state of Israel, but there was no payback in terms of concessions to the Palestinian Arabs. That was what radicalized the Hamas people and made them to be the dominant force. Recall that by 2006,
but Professor, they gave them the territory. They gave them the territory for self-determination. So wasn't that the beginnings of concessions? And they made many other concessions, Israel, along the way down the years.
The concessions were not comprehensive enough to assuage the agonies of people who are aggrieved. West Bank was still substantially controlled by the state of Israel. East Jerusalem is still occupied. From 2006, Gaza City was completely locked down. And so what's the concession that you could say that was made that was commensurate with the risk that PLO and Yasser Arafat took? I couldn't see that. And that is why this violent tendency is continuing. And until and unless we get the two parties to sit down and agree to this two-party solution, we're not going to have an end to this. And that is where the role of the United States of America becomes very, very important.
Thank you so much, Professor. I wish we had more time to continue, but we'll have to leave it there. Professor Olufemi Mimiko, Professor of Political Science and Comparative Political Economy and International Relations, thank you for being on the program this morning.
My pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Still to come, artists gather in Iraq to paint portraits in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza. More details in a bit. Please stay with us. Welcome to the final stretch of this morning's coverage of Israel-Hamas war. Thousands of Indonesians gathered in the nation's capital to show solidarity with the Palestinians and condemn Israel's actions in the ongoing conflict. Participants stemming from various states, faiths, and age groups crowded in their thousands at the National Monument in Jakarta, holding Indonesian and Palestinian flags, shouting slogans in support of the Palestinian cause. The world's largest Muslim population has regularly expressed support for Palestinian statehood in the past, and large pro-Palestinian protests have occurred frequently since the outbreak of the conflict on October the 7th. The Indonesian president released the first batch of humanitarian aid to Gaza that included food and medical supplies. Meanwhile, thousands of pro-Palestinian protesters filled the streets of Toronto and Ottawa in Canada's Ontario province, calling for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza. Last week, Canada's Prime Minister reiterated a call for humanitarian pause in the conflict and says there is little time left to get Canadians and hostages out while delivering badly needed aid.
I'm here to demand a ceasefire as a bare minimum to end the violent attacks by the State of Israel against innocent children and civilians in Gaza. A ceasefire is just a starting point. I think as artists we have the unique capacity to touch people in their spirit, and I think that's what we need right now.
And finally, a group of Iraqi artists in Basra organized an event to paint artwork that depicts scenes of the war faced by Palestinians in Gaza that has been widely shared on social media. The artists say they organized the event in solidarity with the Palestinians in the besieged strip. The event coordinator Hussein Al-Najjar says the main drive behind this work is to show what innocent residents suffer from, including destruction and bearing the brunt of all these weapons, bombs and rockets. We try to at least console them with simple things using our art and culture, hoping the message will reach the whole world. Thank you for watching this morning's coverage of Israel-Hamas war. I'm Olumide Macaulay.